The long hallways of the Northwood Performing Arts Academy always smelled the same. It was a mix of expensive perfume, floor wax, and the faint, dusty scent of old sheet music. For most students, it was the smell of opportunity. For Clara, it was the smell of work. She would walk these halls twice a day. Once in the morning as a student, her head down, clutching her worn-out books, and again in the evening as a helper, her hands in rubber gloves, pushing a heavy mop bucket. Clara was a ghost in her own school. She was there on a scholarship, a fact that felt like a brand on her forehead. The other students with their designer bags and easy laughter moved through the world as if they owned it. They talked about their private tutors and the pianos their parents had bought for them. Things so far from Clara's reality, they might as well have been talking about life on another planet. They barely saw her. To them, she was just the cleaner's daughter, a shadow that moved along the walls. A part of the building's background noise. Her mother, Maria, was the head custodian. A woman with tired eyes but a back that never seemed to break. She worked from before the sun came up until long after it went down, making the grand academy shine. Clara loved her mother with a fierce, protective love. She also felt the weight of her mother's sacrifice every single day. That's why she helped. After her last class, while other kids went to rehearsals or out for pizza, Clara would change into old jeans and a t-shirt and get to work. She'd empty the overflowing trash cans in the practice rooms, wipe down the mirrors in the dance studios, and polish the endless expanse of marble floors until she could see her own tired face looking back up at her. It was during one of these evenings that she found her escape. Tucked away at the end of a forgotten corridor on the 3rd floor was a small rehearsal room. It was used for storage now, filled with broken music stands and chairs stacked like a sleeping metal giant. And in the corner, under a sheet that looked like it hadn't been lifted in years, was an old upright piano. It wasn't a gleaming grand like the ones on the main stage. Its wood was scuffed, the ivory on a few of the keys was chipped, and it was slightly out of tune. To Clara, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Her mother had found an old, beat-up keyboard at a thrift store years ago, and Clara had taught herself to play by watching videos online and reading library books. Music was the one place where the noise in her head went quiet. It was the language she spoke when she had no words, so she started a secret ritual. Every night after she finished her cleaning duties and her mother had gone home, Clara would sneak into that little room. She would pull the dusty sheet off the piano, run her hand over its cool wooden body, and sit on the wobbly bench. The first few notes were always a bit jarring, a little off-key, but she didn't mind. It was real in that room. She wasn't the invisible scholarship kid or the cleaner's daughter. She was just Clara. Her fingers, which were often sore from scrubbing floors, would come alive on the keys. She played the pieces she loved, complicated and full of feeling. She didn't have a teacher to tell her she was holding her hands wrong or playing too fast. She just played. She poured all the things she couldn't say into the music. Frustration of being ignored, the loneliness of the lunch table where she always sat alone, the deep, aching love for her hard-working mother, it all flowed out of her. The music was sometimes angry, sometimes sad, but it was always honest. It was her story, told in a language no one else could hear. One Tuesday night, the academy was quieter than usual. A storm was rolling in, and the wind rattled the windows. Clara had finished her work early and found herself in her sanctuary, the door slightly ajar. She was lost in a piece by a composer she'd just discovered, a storm of a piece that matched the weather outside. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying with the music as her fingers danced across the keys. She was playing with a raw, untamed passion, completely unaware of anything else in the world. Down the hall, a figure was making his final rounds before heading home. It was Mr. Harrison, the academy's piano master. He was a man with a reputation as stern as his perfectly pressed suits. He was a genius, everyone said, but he had little patience for anything less than perfection. Students feared him, and his rare compliments were treasured like gold. As he walked past the storage room, he stopped. He frowned. It was past hours. No one should be playing. He was about to push the door open and give the rule breaker a piece of his mind when the sound coming from inside made him pause. It wasn't the polished, technically perfect music he was used to hearing from his best students. This was different, was messy, a little wild, and filled with something he couldn't quite put his finger on. It was feeling. Mr. Harrison moved silently to the small, square window in the door. He peered through the grimy glass, expecting to see one of his senior students messing around. But it wasn't. It was a girl he barely recognized. A quiet girl from one of his lower-level classes. The one who always sat in the back and never spoke. He knew her face, mostly because he'd seen her helping the cleaning staff. He watched, completely captivated, as this forgotten girl poured her entire soul into the dusty, forgotten piano. He saw the way her shoulders moved with the crescendos, the way her face was a mask of pure concentration and emotion. He stood there in the dark hallway, listening as the girl's music shook the silent room. And for the first time, in a very long time, Mr. Harrison felt truly surprised. The next day felt different. The hallways seemed longer, the lights brighter. Clara kept her head down more than usual, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She was waiting. She didn't know for what, but she knew something was coming. The feeling was confirmed when a note was slipped into her locker during lunch. It was a simple, cream-colored card with elegant, sharp handwriting. It requested her presence in Mr. Harrison's office after her last class. Her stomach did a flip. This was it. Either she was in trouble for being in the room after hours, or she didn't dare think about the other possibility. Mr. Harrison's office was as stern as the man himself. Shelves lined with books about music, theory, and history, a large, dark wood desk that was perfectly clear except for a single pen lined up parallel to the edge, and the faint smell of old paper and leather. He didn't smile when she walked in, just gestured to a hardback chair in front of his desk. "I heard you playing last night," he said, his voice flat and without emotion. Clara's hands grew clammy. She opened her mouth to apologize, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I want you to play for me, now." In the main audition hall, it wasn't a request. It was a command. Walking onto the empty stage of the main auditorium was terrifying. It was so big, so empty. The single grand piano sitting under the bright lights looked like a monster. She had never played on anything so expensive, so perfect. Mr. Harrison sat in the middle of the empty seats, a shadow in the vast darkness. Clara took a deep breath, sat on the cold leather bench, and placed her shaking fingers on the keys. She decided to play the same piece she was playing the night before, a complicated piece full of loud, angry chords and soft, sad melodies. It was the only thing she could think of. As she played, she tried to forget he was there. She tried to go back to that feeling in the dusty storage room, where it was just her and the music. But it was impossible. Every note she played felt judged. She could feel his eyes on her, analyzing, critiquing. Her passion was still there, but now it was mixed with a desperate need to impress him. Her technique, which she had never been taught, was messy. She used her whole body, her shoulders hunching, her head bobbing. She sometimes hit the keys too hard, the sound ringing out harshly in the perfect acoustics of the hall. When she finished, the final note hung in the air for a moment before disappearing into the silence. She didn't dare turn around. There was a long pause. "You have feeling," Mr. Harrison finally said, his voice echoing in the empty room. It didn't sound like a compliment. "But your technique is wild, untrained. It's like you're shouting when you should be speaking." He stood up. "I am placing you in the intermediate ensemble. You need to learn the basics. Discipline, structure. Report to rehearsal tomorrow at 4. The intermediate ensemble. It wasn't a rejection, but it wasn't a victory either. It felt like he was putting her in a box. A small box labeled "not good enough yet." She had hoped for more, for a chance for him to see the fire in her and not just the smoke. But she just nodded and said, "Thank you, sir." Walking into the intermediate ensemble rehearsal room the next day was like walking into another country. The other students were all there, chatting and laughing. They had shiny, new instruments and leather-bound folders of music. Clara clutched her folder, a simple 3-ring binder with pages that were starting to tear at the holes. She found an empty seat in the back, near a boy with perfectly combed hair and an expensive watch. This was Julian. Julian was the star of the academy. Everyone knew his name. He had won competitions since he was a child. His playing was famous for being technically perfect, every note exactly as the composer intended. He was the model student, and he knew it. He looked Clara up and down as she sat down, a small, dismissive smirk on his face. The rehearsal started, and Clara immediately felt out of place. They were playing a piece she didn't know, and the other students flew through it with ease. She stumbled, her fingers fumbling on the keys she didn't know. Wrong. A sharp voice whispered next to her. It was Julian. He didn't even look at her. The F sharp is supposed to be a G natural there. It's basic. A hot blush crept up Clara's neck. She focused harder, trying to ignore him, but her confidence was already shaken. Later, when they were taking a break, Julian walked past her chair. He glanced down at her open music folder. You know, he said loudly enough for a few others to hear, if you can't afford proper sheet music, the library has copies. You don't have to use that. He pointed at a page where she had written notes in the margin, and the paper was soft from being handled. So much. A few of the other students snickered. Clara felt a knot of shame and anger tighten in her stomach. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. She just stared down at her music, at the worn-out pages that held so much of her heart. In that moment, she hated them. She hated their easy confidence and their expensive things and the way. They made her feel small. The weeks that followed were a slow kind of torture. Every rehearsal was the same. She would try her best to keep up, but she was always a step behind. Julian would make little comments, not always to her, but loud enough for her to hear. He'd critique her posture, her timing, her interpretation. The other students started to pick up on it, treating her like she was a project that was failing. They didn't include her in their conversations. They moved their chairs away from hers. The isolation she had felt as a shadow in the hallways was now magnified under the bright, unforgiving lights of the rehearsal room. The worst part was that she started to believe them. The weight of their constant dismissal was crushing. She began to second-guess everything. When she played, she didn't hear the music anymore. She heard Julian's voice in her head telling her she was wrong. Her fingers, which once felt so free on the keys of the dusty upright piano, now felt stiff and clumsy. The passion was still there, buried deep inside, but it was getting harder and harder to find. She was trying to fit into their world, to play with the precision they wanted. But it was like trying to put a wild bird in a tiny cage. The music was dying inside her, and she was starting to think that maybe she didn't belong at the academy after all. Maybe Mr. Harrison had been right to put her in her place. Maybe she was just the cleaner's daughter who had gotten lucky, and now her luck had run out. The announcement for the annual showcase competition appeared on the Academy's main bulletin board on a crisp Monday morning. It was a large, glossy poster with gold lettering. It's promising a grand prize, a full scholarship to the prestigious Royal Conservatory of Music. The news spread through the hallways like wildfire. For students like Julian, it was just another step on their planned path to greatness. He was seen smiling confidently, already talking about the piece he would choose. Something complex and impressive that would showcase his flawless technique. For Clara, it felt like a joke. She would walk past the poster, and the bold letters seemed to mock her. A scholarship. She was already on one, and she felt like she was barely holding on. The idea of competing on the main stage in front of everyone was terrifying. For days, she ignored the sign-up sheet that was pinned next to the poster. She watched as other students added their names, their handwriting neat and full of purpose. She told herself it wasn't for people like her. It was for the Julians of the world. It's the ones who had been trained since they could walk. It's the ones who never had to worry about where their next sheet of music was coming from. The comments from the ensemble rehearsals echoed in her mind. Wrong note, bad timing, you don't have the discipline. She had started to hear those voices even when she was alone. A constant chorus of doubt that drowned out her own music. One evening, after another long and disheartening rehearsal, she was helping her mother polish the brass railings in the main lobby. Her mother was humming a soft, old tune, a sound from her childhood that always brought Clara a strange sense of peace. As she worked, she looked at the poster again. The Royal Conservatory. It was a dream she had never allowed herself to have, a place that existed only in fairy tales. But then she thought about her mother, humming softly while her hands worked tirelessly on the cold metal. She thought about the sacrifices, the missed birthdays, the double shifts. A wave of something new washed over her. It wasn't confidence, not yet. It was defiance. What if she didn't do it for them? What if she didn't do it to win? What if she just did it for her? What if she did it to prove to herself that the fire inside her hadn't been completely extinguished? The next day, with a heart hammering against her ribs, she walked up to the sign-up sheet. With a pen that was running out of ink, she scribbled her name at the bottom of the list in a small, hesitant handwriting that looked nothing like the others. The moment she did it, a wave of panic washed over her. But it was too late to turn back. Now came the hardest part, choosing the music. She spent hours in the library, flipping through books of composers. Bach, Mozart, Beethoven. It was all the music Julian and the others played. It was beautiful, but it felt like a language she didn't speak. It was all about rules and precision. Then, tucked away in a dusty corner, she found a book of Liszt's compositions. She put on a pair of headphones and listened to a recording of his Hungarian Rhapsody. No. 2. From the first few notes, she was captivated. It wasn't neat and tidy. It was wild and untamed. It started with a deep, sad longing, then exploded into a frantic, joyful dance. It was chaotic and passionate and full of fire. It was a piece that didn't just require perfect fingers. It demanded a soul. She knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that this was her piece. She couldn't outplay Julian on his terms, but maybe, just maybe, she could move people on hers. There was one big problem. She couldn't practice this piece on the old, out-of-tune upright in the storage room. It needed a real piano, a grand piano, to do it justice. But the practice rooms were always booked by the more advanced students, and she was too intimidated to ask for special permission. Then an idea, born of desperation, struck her. One night when her mother was asleep, Clara quietly took the master key ring from the hook by the door. She took it to a 24-hour hardware store the next day and had a copy made of the key to the auditorium. It felt like a huge, rebellious act, a secret that gave her a thrilling, scary kind of power. Her new ritual began. Long after the academy had gone dark, she would let herself into the silent, empty auditorium. The vast room, usually so intimidating, felt like her own private kingdom. A single ghost light cast a soft, ethereal glow on the stage, making the grand piano look like a sleeping beast. She would sit on the bench, her fingers trembling slightly, and begin to play. In the beginning, she was hesitant. The notes of the Liszt piece were difficult, and the sheer power of the grand piano was overwhelming. But night after night, she returned. She played in the dark, with no one to judge her, no one to tell her she was doing it wrong. Slowly, she started to let go. She stopped thinking about technique and discipline. She started thinking about the long hallways she mopped. The feeling of being invisible, the pride in her mother's eyes, the sting of Julian's words. She poured all of it into the music. The sad parts of the Rhapsody became her loneliness. The frantic, joyful parts became her defiance. She wasn't just playing the notes anymore. She was telling her story. One night, she was so lost in the music, her body swaying to the stormy rhythm, that she didn't hear the quiet click of the auditorium door opening. She was in the middle of the most passionate, furious part of the piece. Her fingers flying across the keys, the sound filling the huge room like a thunderstorm. When the final crashing chord faded into silence, she was breathing heavily, her heart pounding. She leaned forward, resting her forehead on the cool wood of the piano, completely spent. That's when she saw him. Standing in the aisle, halfway between her and the door, was a dark figure. It was Mr. Harrison. Clara's blood ran cold. She was caught. She had broken the rules, used the hall without permission, and now she was going to be expelled. She opened her mouth to stammer an apology, but he held up a hand. He walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps the only sound in the vast silence. He didn't stop until he was at the edge of the stage, looking up at her. His face was hidden in the shadows, impossible to read. "Do you know what you're playing?" he asked, his voice quiet but cutting through the silence. Clara just shook her head, unable to speak. He was quiet for a long moment, just looking at her. Then he said again, but this time, mean it. He turned and walked away, disappearing back into the darkness of the auditorium, leaving Clara alone on the stage, stunned but with a tiny, flickering flame of hope reignited in her chest. The day of the showcase felt like walking on a tightrope. The air in the academy was electric, buzzing with nervous energy and excited chatter. Students in their best clothes rushed past, their voices echoing in the hallways. For Clara, it was like moving through a dream. She went through her classes in a daze, the words of her teachers a distant hum. All she could think about was the stage, the piano, and the 7 minutes that would define everything. Her mother had woken up extra early to make her a small breakfast, pressing a warm tortilla into her hand. "No matter what happens," Maria had said, her eyes full of a quiet, unwavering belief. "I am so proud of you." Those words were Clara's anchor. Backstage, the atmosphere was thick with perfume and panic. Students were stretching their fingers, whispering last-minute advice to each other, and pacing in the small, cramped space. Clara found a quiet corner and tried to make herself invisible, just like she used to in the hallways. She could hear the muffled sounds of the performances from the other side of the heavy velvet curtain. A polite smattering of applause, then another and another. There were good, solid performances, the kind the Academy was known for. Technically perfect, but forgettable. Then she heard it. The distinct, clean, and precise sound of a Bach concerto. It was Julian. Even from backstage, she could tell it was flawless. Each note was a perfect pearl, strung together with mathematical precision. When he finished, the applause was louder and more enthusiastic than for the others. He came backstage, his face flushed with confidence, and a few of his friends patted him on the back. He caught Clara's eye as he walked past her, and for a moment, she saw that familiar, dismissive smirk. It was a look that said, "The real competition is over now." A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. All the old doubts came rushing back. Who was she to think she could compete with this? She was just a girl with messy technique and a stolen key. A stagehand in a black t-shirt poked his head in. "Clara, you're on next." Her heart leaped into her throat. This was it. She stood up, her legs feeling like they were made of jelly. As she walked toward the curtain, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Mr. Harrison. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes weren't stern either. They were just calm. "Remember what I told you," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "Mean it." That was all he said, but it was enough. The fire he had helped her find flickered back to life. She took a deep breath and nodded. Walking onto the stage was like stepping into another world. The heat from the spotlights hit her face, and for a second, she was blinded. The auditorium was a sea of shadowy faces, a huge dark space that seemed to stretch on forever. She could see the judges' table in the front, their faces serious and expectant. As she walked toward the grand piano, a ripple of whispers went through the audience. They saw her simple dress, her lack of confident swagger. They saw the cleaner's daughter, and they were already settling in for a polite but ultimately underwhelming performance. She sat on the bench, the cold leather a stark contrast to the heat of the lights. She placed her fingers on the keys, and for a moment, the world was silent. She could hear her own heartbeat, a frantic drum against her ribs. She closed her eyes, blocking out the hundreds of eyes on her. She thought of her mother's hands, worn and rough from cleaning. She thought of Julian's smirk. She thought of Mr. Harrison's words. And then she began to play. The first notes of the Hungarian Rhapsody were not loud. They were soft, full of a deep, melancholic longing. It was the sound of loneliness, of walking down empty hallways, of being invisible. The audience, who had been ready for a simple tune, leaned in, surprised by the raw emotion in those quiet notes. The music was a story, and they were starting to listen. Then, slowly, the music began to change. A new rhythm started to emerge, a hesitant dance that grew faster and more confident with every bar. Clara's body, which had been stiff with nerves, began to relax. Her shoulders started to move with the music. Her head swayed. She was no longer just playing notes. She was having a conversation with the piano. The melody grew stronger, more complex, and then, without warning, it exploded. The sound that erupted from the piano was not just music. It was a force of nature. It was a storm, a fire, a battle cry. Her fingers, which had once felt clumsy, were now flying across the keys with a fierce, untamed energy. She wasn't thinking about technique or discipline. She was thinking about every time she had been ignored, every condescending whisper, every moment of doubt, and she was pouring all of it into the music. The quiet girl was gone. In her place was a powerful, passionate artist, telling a story of struggle and defiance with every thundering chord. The audience was no longer just listening. They were feeling it. The music seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, up the legs of their chairs, and into their very bones. People who had been leaning back in their seats were now leaning forward, their mouths slightly open in awe. The judges, who had been scribbling notes, had put down their pens and were simply staring, completely captivated. In the front row, Julian sat frozen, his perfectly composed face a mask of shock and confusion. This was not the messy, untrained girl from the ensemble. This was something else entirely. This was a power he had never seen, a passion he had never been taught. Clara was lost in the storm of her own making. Her hair had come loose from its clip and was flying around her face as her body moved with the music. The final section of the piece was a frantic, joyous dance, a celebration of survival. She played with a desperate, beautiful intensity, channeling every ounce of her being into the sound. And then came the final chords. She didn't just play them. She struck them with all the force she had, a series of powerful, crashing notes that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. When the last note faded, it didn't just disappear. It hung in the air, a raw, ringing echo of the story she had just told. And then there was silence. Not the polite waiting for the applause silence. It was a heavy, thick, absolute silence. The entire room was holding its breath. Hundreds of people, stunned into stillness, processing the incredible thing they had just witnessed. In that profound silence, Clara had done more than just play the piano. She had made the world stop and listen. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was heavy with the echo of the final chord. A sound that seemed to have soaked into the walls, the floor, the very air in the room. For Clara, time seemed to stop. She sat at the piano, her fingers still resting on the keys, her chest heaving. Her ears were ringing, and the bright spotlights blurred into a single blinding star. She couldn't see the audience anymore, only a vast, dark void. A cold wave of fear washed over her. Had she been too loud, too wild? Had her passion, her story, been nothing but an ugly mess to them? She had poured her entire soul onto that stage, and now, in the crushing silence, she felt terrifyingly empty. She had failed. She was sure of it. Then, from the back of the auditorium, a single person began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate sound, one clap at a time. It wasn't polite. It was a declaration. Then another person joined in, and another. The sound grew slowly at first, then gathering speed and strength until it was no longer just clapping. It was a roar. It was a physical force, a wave of sound that crashed over the stage and washed away all of Clara's fear. The sea of shadowy faces was no longer still. It was a wall of people, rising to their feet as one. The applause was deafening, a thunderous, joyous noise that shook the room just as much as her final chord had. Clara sat frozen, her mind struggling to catch up. She looked out at the standing ovation, at the hundreds of people on their feet, cheering for her. Her eyes scanned the front row, searching for one face. She found him. Julian was standing too, but his hands weren't clapping. They were hanging limply at his sides. His face, usually so composed and confident, was pale and slack with shock. He was looking at her not with anger or jealousy, but with a dawning, humbled awe. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, a beautiful, terrifying ghost that had shown him a world he never knew existed. The head judge, a stern woman with silver hair, walked to the microphone. The applause slowly died down as people turned to listen. "There is no need for deliberation," she said, her voice firm but filled with an emotion that hadn't been there all night. "The winner of this year's showcase and the recipient of the full scholarship to the Royal Conservatory of Music is Clara." The name hung in the air for a second before the applause erupted again, even louder this time. A stagehand came out and gently guided a stunned Clara to the center of the stage. A heavy, gleaming trophy was placed in her hands, but she barely felt its weight. She just stood there, blinking in the lights, a shy smile finally breaking through her shock. She had done it. She had really done it. After the ceremony, the backstage area was chaos. People were congratulating her, patting her on the back, people who had never even said hello to her before. But she only had eyes for one person. She pushed through the crowd and found her mother near the exit, her face streaked with tears. Maria didn't say anything. She just pulled her daughter into a hug so tight it almost took her breath away. In her mother's arms, surrounded by the noise and the celebration, Clara finally felt real. "I knew it," her mother whispered, her voice thick with pride. "I always knew you could shake the world." Later, as things started to calm down, Mr. Harrison appeared. He looked the same as always, stern and proper in his suit. He walked up to her, and for a moment, Clara thought he was going to critique her performance. Instead, he just looked at her, a long, steady look. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched, almost forming a smile. "You meant it," he said. It was the highest praise he could have given her. He gave a short, stiff nod and turned and walked away, leaving Clara with a warmth in her chest that was brighter than all the spotlights on stage. The rest of the school year was different. Clara was no longer a ghost. She was the girl who made the piano sing. Students she didn't know would smile at her in the hallways. The whispers that followed her were no longer of disdain, but of wonder. In the ensemble, the dynamic had completely shifted. Julian was quiet, but he was different. He no longer made snide comments. One day he approached her after rehearsal. "That piece you played," he said, not looking her in the eye. "The list I've been listening to it. I never understood. The feeling in it, I do now." It wasn't an apology, but it was something better. It was respect. The final concert of the year was the Academy's most important event, and Clara was the featured soloist. This time when she walked on stage, she didn't feel fear. She felt a calm, quiet confidence. She was wearing a new dress, a simple but elegant one that her mother had saved up for months to buy. She sat at the grand piano, and the audience fell silent, not out of judgment, but out of anticipation. She played a different piece this time, one that was full of light and hope. Her playing was still filled with passion, but it was no longer desperate. It was the sound of someone who had found their voice. As her fingers danced across the keys, she looked out into the audience and found her mother. Maria was sitting in the front row, not in her cleaner's uniform, but in the new dress she had bought for the showcase. She wasn't working. She was just watching her daughter, her face shining with a love so bright it outshone every light in the auditorium. Clara's story became a legend at the Northwood Performing Arts Academy. A story told to new scholarship students who felt small and out of place. It was a reminder that true artistry wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about having the most expensive lessons or the fanciest clothes. It was about having a story to tell and the courage to tell it with everything you had. She had walked into that academy as a silent shadow, a girl defined by what she lacked. But on that one night, she had filled the room with the one thing she had in abundance, a human heart. She had not just played the piano, she had made the world listen.